Hey, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us again back on YouTube for another conversation regarding mental health. Today's special guest is someone who's new to the Epic Youth family, and I'm very excited to introduce her to you guys and just have a conversation with her. So, Lucia, thank you so much for coming on and just having a conversation. Would you like to introduce yourself and kind of what you do?
Absolutely. So first of all, just thank you for asking me to be here. Hi guys, my name is Lucia and I am newer to Epic. I started coming back in November, December of 2022. And I am by profession a licensed mental health counselor. My practice focuses on trauma and anxiety, and I've been in the field for about 15 years. And I'm excited to just be on here today and just talk about, my walk with God and also just mental health in general. And thank you again for asking me to be here.
Yeah. Can you kind of go into a little bit? Because I'm not sure if we haven't really had or probably will have somebody who's in the field of mental health, like actually professionally in the field. Can you kind of tell us more about what that looks like?
Sure. So I started out my career working at a number of different types of venues. So I was in the public school system for a little while at a charter school working with teens, and I would do weekly groups. We'd go into their schools and we would also host like a 6 day of school on Saturdays and do groups there. A lot of the kids were going through displacement. There had been a flood back in the day. It was like Hurricane Sandy. So some of them had nowhere to live and a lot of mental health issues. And their families had a lot of financial issues going on. So I worked with them through their anxiety. We did a lot of really interesting and creative types of groups where we taught lots of different types of skills, breathing, anxiety reduction, building a support network. I also worked at a number of different private practices, two in California, um, with it was a group of parents who were considered like non-protective parents because their kids had been abused. So I worked with those parents and helped them uncover some of their trauma.
Mm.
I also worked at a full service homeless shelter in San Diego with chronically mentally ill families and singles. I did that for a time. I was a caseworker there. And I also worked at a couple of private practices on Staten Island, New York. And I kind of didn't really know like where I wanted to niche out. And then I realized that my most powerful gifts in life have come from the challenges that I've gone through as a person. So, for those of you that don't know me, I had a pretty challenging upbringing, especially like my preteen and teenage years. I actually ran away from home when I was 12, and it was like kind of intense. And there was like some mental illness in my family and a lot of trauma passed down. So, I've always had a passion for working with preteens and teenagers. And then I set out on my own and I started my own business about 8 years ago. And I found that I really liked working with teenagers. I also worked with a lot of young women and some moms as I became a mom, as I got older. And what I primarily started to get trained in was somatic therapy. So for those of you who don't know what that is, usually when you go to therapy, it's just talk therapy where you're just talking about what's going on. But I later learned that you really cannot repair trauma in the body without doing somatic work. So I actually had my own therapist that like totally changed my life. And a lot of the symptoms that I was having, like anxiety and racing thoughts and a lot of just negativity and just body symptoms, I started seeing this somatic therapist and we started doing these therapeutic interventions that like really got beyond talk therapy and really helped me see a big difference in my mindset, and my symptoms in my body started to go away. And I was like, whoa, this is not what they teach you in school. This is amazing. And I went out and got trained in all the different somatic therapies that I could find. So IFS, brain spotting. And so I got my later, I hired a staff that works with me, other therapists that I like really love. They're an amazing team. And we all got trained in somatic therapy. So now we've sort of dedicated the practice around helping people overcome anxiety and trauma.
That's awesome. And can you talk a little bit about trauma living in the body? Because I think a lot of people don't know that and they experience a lot of symptoms, I before I knew that, I the same thing. And when somebody had told me that, I'm like, wow, that makes a lot of sense. And it's even something that, I mean, I don't know if there's other schools that talk about it more, but being in grad school for psychology, like there's just things we don't talk about. And I feel like that's a huge thing that there wasn't, as far as my grad experience personally, and I won't throw the school name under the bus. Um, but we never talked about that. So can you please just explain that to everybody?
Sure. I didn't learn about this in grad school either, and I feel like majority of what I've learned has just been through life experience. And as far as talking about trauma living in the body, so the best way for me to explain it is just to give you like a for instance example. So let's say that as an adult or a teen, you struggle with, let's say, criticism is one of your things. Like somebody gives you feedback, and like let's use a 1 to 10 scale, right? So 10 is like a very intense reaction in your body, and 1 is no reaction. So let's say that it would be common if we rated, I don't know, 1,000 people to have a level 3 of discomfort in their body, but you have a 9, right? So what happens is our brain's really interesting how it works, especially during the formative years when it's still developing. Like I believe it keeps developing up until age 21, where it's has certain neural pathways set in a specific way. So our brain stores experiences and memories and triggers in something called a feeling network. So shame, anger, grief, these are all like different types of feeling networks, and some of them are interconnected. So let's say when you were really young, like 5, you had a parent that was super, super critical and like you couldn't do anything right, and they had like a negative spirit about them. So often when the younger we are, the more we internalize those type of external stressors as like there's something wrong with us, and we pair it with like deep shame. So what happens is when you have an experience like later on in life that links to a feeling network trigger from earlier in life, your brain and body start to pair it with the same chemicals that would have come up when you initially experienced the first exposure to that trauma. I also just want to pause here for a second, because when I say trauma, a lot of people think it has to be like I was in a war and I saw somebody pass away, or I was in a car accident. And there's so many different types of trauma, and it's really easy to completely invalidate something and say, oh, that's not trauma. And I think we have to be really mindful of the ways that a person's brain and body and emotions can be impacted. So trauma really just is encountering a situation where your central nervous system does not have the ability to like regulate itself. And the more it's been repeated, the more entrenched it sort of gets in your central nervous system. So that's why I like to use childhood as a good example, because your ability to regulate yourself under the age of, like from, let's say from 0 to 7 is so small in comparison to somebody who's an adult. And then even 7 to, let's say, 18 is like a middle range of regulation. And there are plenty of adults who still really can't self-regulate because they're living in these old traps of these old, I guess, paradigms and dynamics, and never really learning to overcome that. And so going back to what I was saying about how trauma lives in the body. So let's say you have a traumatic event, especially when you're younger, but it could be when you're older. Your brain, if it can't process it at the time, like it's too much, a lot of times it will do something where it breaks the memory off from your conscious mind. So things you can access later, things you could remember, it stores it in your subconscious. And then it also stores all the chemicals, like the stress or fear chemicals like cortisol, adrenaline in the body. So now later, let's say years go by, you're, I don't know, 2016, you get your first job and you have a really critical boss, let's say, and that person's coming down on you, or it feels like they are. Now we're back to the scale of 1 to 10, right? So if you had no previous trauma in this area, you might have reacted at a 3, you might have been upset, but you would have been able to talk about it, but you're at a 9 and you don't know why. It's because the subconscious stuff, the memories in that feeling network are now coming up. They're telling your brain that you are in danger, right? From like shame overload, or maybe you had a physically abusive situation, whatever those aspects of the initial event, whatever chemicals line up with that will come up in this situation. And you might be like, oh my gosh, like, well, I don't get it. Like, they're just saying I didn't do a good job or that I need to work on it. Why is this so triggering for me? And it's because there's unresolved trauma living in the body, but it's subconscious. So you really like have no idea. It seems like it's coming out of nowhere.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I think that goes back to like talk therapy. You know, so many people figure out when you really dive deep, like why they're feeling a certain way. And there's things that they remember that at the time they didn't think it was a big deal because, you know, they were at the 3, they were at a lower level on the scale when they initially had experienced that. And then come back later, they're like, that makes sense. Maybe that's where it started. And it could be something, again, you don't have to go to war. Like, I feel like there's little things that are just like traumatizing in everyday life. You know, it could be the smallest thing that, you know, maybe you're not used to in the environment and stuff. And maybe you're even used to it, but people don't realize sometimes, you know, things outside of like grand experiences can also be traumatizing. So thank you for sharing that piece of information. That's really good. And if you're watching it, you should write that down and look that up for real. All right. So my next question is, what is mental health to you? Which I feel like is such a funny question to ask because, if anything, you probably should ask me that, considering you have so much more experience. But what does that mean to you?
Sure. So mental health is part of health. And when I think about physical health, I think about like your ability to experience a full range of life, right? Like not being limited, not, constantly treating some sort of, issue, being proactive, like when you think of taking care of your physical body. So I think with mental health, it's similar. It's having an awareness. Like for example, with physical health, there's not a lot of information out there that we're taught in school about nutrition, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there's almost zero information out there in school about emotional health, emotional hygiene, well-being. How do you get your feelings out instead of keeping them in? How do you know who you are versus who society tells you who you are? How do you not be of the world, but in the world?
Mm-hmm.
And how do you frame your identity, right? Because from the time you're small, you have your parents, you have your school, you have the media, you have your friends, and they all sort of affect that. So I think mental health centers around knowing who you are, being aware of your emotional needs, whether that looks like a boundary or discernment around places and people that are healthy for you to spend time around versus not.
Mm-hmm.
Outlets, emotional outlets, knowing what those are, healthy ones, singing, painting, support network. And then I think support network's like its own thing. I think that we all need to know that like we're not an island and that we were created to be, I want to say, in relationship to each other. So having that strong support network of people, like I have my go-to people, whether it's parenting or marriage or just my faith or colleagues, with work, whatever it is, or for you, if you're younger, just, you might have friends that you like to do schoolwork with, or like a hobby with, or sports with, or you talk about, your faith, whatever it is. But not having that solid support network is where I see a lot of people go down a path of having, poor mental health. And I think it's important to just value it as much as any other aspect of your life because we're mind, body, spirit. So it's very important. And I heard this somewhere, but I love this, like where attention goes, energy flows.
Mm-hmm.
So if we're not aware of what we're giving our attention to, whether it's a negative mindset or something that really bothered us and just replaying it in our head, like our mental health can really start to decline too.
Yeah. Yeah, that's good. That's good. Yep. Things breathe when you give it life. And if you give it life and your attention and stuff like that, yep, absolutely. That's good. So can you describe your mental health journey and kind of what your relationship with God has been through that?
Totally. So like I said earlier, I don't know how much I got into it, but I had sort of a rough, I want to say, adolescence / childhood. There was mental illness in my family, and there's something called generational trauma. So what happens is you'll see this pretty widespread, like if a grandparent or a set of grandparents had specific issues, a lot of times they get passed down to your parents and then to you. And it's sort of like we only know like what we're taught until we become adults and or we become curious, adolescents, and we start to like do some research on our own. Um, and I didn't really know how to manage it because I was very young. So I grew up very like hyper vigilant, super like on the lookout for danger all the time, sort of rebellious because I felt like adults really didn't know what they were talking about. I didn't really trust them because I had been harmed a lot, like emotionally and physically. And I sort of tried to fix it myself. And I wish I had had a deeper relationship with God when I was younger, because I think I would have learned to turn to him more. And instead of doing that, I became like super hyper independent and self-sufficient. And to a degree, it helped me survive. But as I got older, I had to sort of unlearn that way of thinking because I wasn't going to be able to access like the wisdom, guidance, and like peace that can come from knowing God. So as I got older, when I was 17, I moved out of my parents' house and I moved out to the city. Went away to college, and my anxiety was always there. I think I used it as a springboard for, high achieving. I always had really good grades, and I was super like OCD, like on top of everything, and I would have panic attacks, and um actually got into drinking alcohol as a coping mechanism. And it seemed like the cool, fun thing to do. And like I could just let my hair down or whatever. And like little by slowly, like it really started to take over my life and sort of like completely disconnect me from myself and sort of like derail me. And then in 2009, so what year was that? I think I was a junior in college. Like drastic things started to happen in my life all at once. Um, like it's hard to even get into all the details, but basically like my family just went through like a dark night of like this all like horrible things happening. Like we lost our business, we lost our home, my dad got diagnosed with cancer. My brother was having problems with addiction and he was like in and out of jail. I got in a car accident. There was just horrible things happening. And in that year is when I started to have a relationship with God that I had never had. Like as a kid, I prayed and I went to CCD, but it was more of like a religion and just like a task that you check off and just something that you kind of just routinely do. And I remember clear as day, I think I was 19, and I was sitting in a waiting room just wrapped in fear and like feeling like I just had nowhere to go. And I felt God just like I heard someone talking and I felt like I thought it was a person. And I turned
Wow.
and it was God. And he was
Wow.
saying to me, like, don't be afraid. Like wherever you go, like I'm with you. And if I send you somewhere, it's gonna be for a reason. And I don't know how to explain it, but just like I felt everything lift off of me in that moment. And I just had clarity and peace. And like after that experience, like, the worldly clamors can still try to come back in and mess with your mind, but like nobody could tell me I didn't have that experience.
Mm-hmm.
I started like a whole new journey, which took me really like years to like get to the point where I am now, but it was a big starting point for me. And then I'll just fast forward. So I was 19 back then, and I'm 33 now. So roughly a little over 10 years. I'll talk a little bit about how it developed. I think one of the really important things to acknowledge is the lies that come into your brain when you're trying to shift from dark to light, from fear to peace.
Yeah, that's good.
And so what I experienced a lot of was the enemy just like lying to me and just saying like, you're never going to be able to stop drinking. You're going to be miserable. You're going to have a miserable life. You already screwed your life up, this and that. And that awareness of it, after having that glimpse of peace and that what it feels like to have access to God, I wanted more. And I would love to tell you that like it was an overnight process, but it definitely was not. And it took me years of just like actively seeking God, like first thing in the morning, making mistakes, learning that doing it my way was my way of just not trusting God, still trying to run the show, still living in fear. And God helped me to just stop leaning on alcohol and introduce me to a whole new community of people who loved God and who just were genuinely there to, want to be good people. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and I've been through a lot of, I call them fires. So we have to walk through the fire to get to the other side. Like the only way through is through. And I don't think God promises us that life's going to be rainbows and sunshine through the rest of life. Like that's not what I think he's promising. I do think he's promising that like if we could lean on him and learn to discern his voice and have people around us that are in a similar value system to bounce things off of, that we can, I call them breadcrumbs. Like he'll just give you like one breadcrumb at a time and like lead you in the right
I
direction.
like that. I like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So for me, like I'll just wrap up the question that you asked me, the answer to it. It was a lot of just like, when you play a video game and you get to the end, and if you don't beat the big boss, you have to like replay the level.
Mm-hmm.
It was a lot of that. It was a lot of like, okay, you are now at this, someone I know says new level, new devil. So you
Yep.
get to this new level, and like anytime I would make a decision where it was like out of fear and not out of listening to God, I would have to replay the level in my life over and over until I got past it. And then over the years, I've gotten better and better at discerning what God's trying to show me. And like it went from like being this thing I did to try to like get something out of it
Mm-hmm.
to being this thing that I need and like really wanting to know God better and seeing time and time again that when I take my will back, it's like, this is the example I always use. So like, let's say you're driving, you're going on a road trip. Let's say you're going to Texas. You've never been there. You're driving, you have God in the passenger seat because we have free will. So he lets us drive the car with the GPS, right? And I'm like, I got it, I got it. And I just keep driving into like a ditch. I make a wrong turn. I just
End
keep
up in
driving.
another state.
Yeah. And I'm just and it wasn't until I rammed into the wall a bunch of times that I was like, okay, just tell me what to do.
Right. Right. That's great. Yeah, no, I've had somewhat of a similar journey in ways, and I really appreciate listening to. I know that like that just blessed me because I know during that journey you feel crazy, like you feel crazy, and having to deal with so many fires. You're like, is anybody seeing this? Like everything's burning to the ground, this, that, and the next, and you feel like you get an exhausted like spirit almost, and it's so much to have to deal with, like around. I feel like 19 for some reason is such a year for a lot of people in either a really good way or a really bad way. um I also coped with a lot of things with drinking. I had a horrible drug addiction, and when I was 19 years old, I had one experience that got me sober, like completely. And it was basically God telling me over and over again, you need to look at your life. Like everything, first off, you don't really have anything besides the drugs and alcohol that you have. You don't have a money, you don't have jobs, you don't have school, you don't. And listen, that doesn't give you all the worth in the world, but like look at what your decisions have done. And so that was a very hard thing. And even after that, I'm going to be 6 years sober this year, but it's been yeah, it's really exciting, but it's been a journey, and the devil lies to you over and over. Like there's so many times, and in the recent years it's been a little better, but sometimes I even have moments where I feel the devil telling me like, you're still that person. Like that person that you were, you are. Like it's not a word, you are that person and you have it in you, and you could blow your life to pieces again, and all this type of stupidity. And it's really about letting go and letting God. I know that's such a cliche quote that a lot of people, but it's true. You have him in the passenger seat, and I've had to hit a lot of walls, a lot of ditches, ran off a couple cliffs, like somehow survived that. But it is so great to have a God that no matter what he says, I'm there. I'm still in the passenger seat, whether we're ramming into walls. So I prefer not to do this, but I'm gonna be there with you anyways. And it's just so comforting. And it really, what you just said really blessed me, because I feel like a lot of that I've felt and dealt with, and I know people who are gonna see this have dealt with that in their own ways. I know a lot of kids in Epic Youth, they unfortunately come from difficult situations, whether it be one way or the other. And, as far as I know, I don't think a lot of them cope with alcohol and drugs, but there's other ways to cope, right? There's sex, there's just bad decisions altogether, which I just used to do everything, honestly. Like any horrible coping mechanism that you could have thrown at me, I was doing. Um, so yeah, God is so good. But thank you so much for sharing that and opening your life and letting everybody know what that looked like. So do you have a piece of advice for the youth pertaining to mental health or pieces of advice?
Okay, I'll think about that. So I maybe I'll just frame this as if I was like talking to my younger self too. What would I
Yes.
want to hear? I would say for those of you that don't feel like you have adults in your life that you can trust, find some, because it's really easy to shut that door on every adult for the ones that have failed you. And having just even one or two that you can trust can make all the difference. And there's two ways, I heard this from somewhere, to learn from mistakes. It's, living it or learning from other people's mistakes. And I always wanted to learn from my own mistakes and didn't want to take any of the advice of anybody else, because I don't know if it was the enemy or pride, but my brain basically just sounded like, well, I'm smarter or I'm different, and that's just
Mm-hmm.
not going to happen to me.
Mm-hmm.
And I say this, I say take every single piece of bonus advice that you could get from somebody else and learn from their experience and skip over the quicksand. Do yourself a favor.
Yep.
Just skip over it if you can. And another thing I would say is that I know that the teenage years can be like some of the most difficult years. Like I lived that between the hormones and the social aspects and the expectations put on you by other people. And I can tell you that like really just like honing into that still small voice and just using peace as a navigator versus people pleasing, impressing your friends, worrying about what other people think about you. That's going to keep you in a safe space versus doing all these things. I don't know where I heard this, but this is not Burger King and like not everybody can have it their way.
Right.
You'll never be able to make everybody happy. But
Mm-hmm.
at the end of the day, your longest standing relationship besides your relationship with God is going to be your relationship with yourself.
Yep.
So you want to be able to look yourself in the eye and in the mirror every day and try your hardest to make choices you respect, because when you ignore that call from your spirit, which you might not even be able to identify at first, but if you ignore that, little by slowly, you start to get disconnected from who you really are. And before you know it, you turn around and you don't even know what this life is about that you're living, because it's been based on fear and people pleasing and looking good and all this stuff you think you need to be okay. So just keep that in mind. I don't know if I went off on a tangent, but that's kind
Yeah.
of what came to me.
No, that's good. That's good. I remember, being in high school and feeling like this is never going to end. And you feel like you're so stuck in that moment and that it's just going to drag forever. Like I used to think, pretty innocently, but stupidly as well. Like, where does your life go after 18? Like, I just like, anything after 18, I'm like, you're old. Like, and now being 25, I feel a lot different. And every time they make jokes, I'm like, no, I'm not, I promise. But yeah, you feel like high school is going to last forever and you make these decisions sometimes that those last forever, but high school does not last forever. And so when you go past that and you do things that affect yourself outside of that, you got to be aware of that. And also, the adult thing is huge, and I do want to touch on that because I am one of those people who thought I knew it all. I thought, because of everything that I had gone through in my childhood and stuff, you do have to grow up faster than other people. So I thought, oh, well, I'm 16, 17, and I've been through a lot, and yeah, I've been through a lot, but I'm still 16, 17 years old, and there's so much more to go through before you really gain that knowledge and wisdom that you think you have. And that's not to devalue any youth at all. Like when myself or Lucia or any of the other youth leaders, Pastor Chris, when they say things to you, it's not to devalue you and your intelligence and your mind and stuff like that. It's to help you out and to help you learn from our mistakes. Like I remember there was this one, truthfully, my youth group experience, I feel when I was in youth group, I felt 50-50 about, because there was just a lot of fleshy things that would happen when it came to how they would treat some of the youth sometimes. And then being a pastor's kid, I feel like it was revved up a little bit more because they had, oh, well, look at the pastor's kid. But like I was with you at the party, so I'm not really like my parents. We were at the same party, my guy. But I did have one youth leader, and I won't say his name, but if he ever sees this, he'll definitely know that it's him. But he was like a big brother to me and a group of us, and he loved us so much and just tried everything he did to pour into us. And when I started to, because I met him when I was 11 years old. So and he wasn't that much older than me. I think he was like 4 or 5 years. So he was still like in school, but he still wanted to be a leader, whatever. And then that continued when I was older. So he was out of school at that point. But when I started getting older and started know it all, I would get really fresh with him sometimes. And he would tell me some things and I couldn't care less to hear it. But then I'd be calling him like, hey, can you pick me up from the party? Like the cops are here. But he would do it. He would do it. That's the funny part. Like he still would take it and he would do it, but he would tell me so many things that at the time I ignored a lot. And then getting older and after getting sober and stuff, I had to do a lot of self reevaluating, but that's a lot of stuff that a lot of things that are planted in me from that time period came from this person. And now reflecting back, like he meant well. And being a youth, you think that every single adult, because of other experience that you have, are like against you and don't want to see you flourish and stuff like that. Like they want to see you flourish, and that's why they're telling you these certain things. And I had to even go back and apologize to him and be like, hey, I love you. You were a friend to me. You led me. You were kind of a mentor, and you really held a lot of our hands through a really rough time, whether we try to pull our hand away from you or not. And even when you were in high school, there were so many things that you did for us that you didn't have to do. And I'm sure you were going through your own stuff. And so I apologized to him, and we had a really nice conversation. And he's doing great now. He has a wife and a kid and stuff, so he's being all cute with her and whatnot. And it's nice. And now we have a way better relationship because I was able to realize all that he had done. So I really want you guys to take both of those tips and really take it to heart, that you have youth leaders and just other adults. They don't even have to be a part of Epic Youth, that do truly love you and are truly on your team. And whether, they're pushing you to run the race or not, it may suck. You may not want to run the race and stuff like that, but they're pushing you because they see the end goal. They see the light at the end of the tunnel. And God too. You don't need to please everybody. You don't need to, some of these people you'll never see again, truthfully. And it's not even anything against them. You're just straight up never going to see them again. And that's okay. But you don't got to live your life according, your entire life according to what happens in such a small time frame. So thank you so much for just sharing all of that. And I know that's definitely, this honestly, forget y'all, this was a conversation for me. I need to hear all this. No, honestly. But yeah, thank you so much for hopping on and just sharing all that you did and giving us all the knowledge and wisdom that you have through all your experiences, because you have had a lot of experiences, a lot of good and, bad too. But, we're able to sit here today and talk about that. So thank you so much. For everybody tuning in, we are going to have links to Lucia's stuff. If you ever want to check it out, if you ever need, advice, encouragement, questions, you could always reach out to us. We'll see you next time at the next conversation. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you for asking me to be here.
Bye, yes. Guys. Bye.